I probably wouldn't have been as annoyed by the sound of the doorbell if I hadn't just gotten the football game on and sat down with a beer. With my wife and 3 daughters out shopping for homecoming dresses, I had the rare opportunity to spend my Saturday watching any and every college game without interruption. Such an occasion deserved, at least in my mind, my full attention. I headed to the door, preparing to get rid of my unwanted guest in a hurry. I opened the door with a flourish, only to have my bad mood get a lot worse. "I don't suppose you've become a Mormon, have you?" were the first words out of my mouth as I perused my ex-wife for the first time in over 18 years. To say Alice was a little confused by my opening salvo would be a bit of an understatement, as she simply stood there with her mouth open. I noticed a 500 series Mercedes in my driveway and the small boulder she was still wearing as a wedding ring, and figured she had remained married to Dr. Joseph Spaulding. Alice seemed to have recovered somewhat from her bemused state as she finally replied. "No, Matthew, I'm not a Mormon," she stated, looking uncomfortable as we both took the sight of each other in. "Why in the world would you ask that?" "Well," I replied seriously, "it's about the only thing that could make this work." "Why are you here, Alice?" Alice seemed suddenly unsure of herself, and I took the opportunity to compare this latest version with the Alice I had known for all those years. At 44, Alice was still a beautiful woman, her long blonde hair now a stylish shoulder length, and her figure now a fuller version of the lithe young woman I had fallen in love with my first year of college. The laugh lines that had always been around the corners of her mouth now seemed to point a little downwards, and the green eyes that had originally captured me seemed a little sadder, but other than that she was simply an older version of my first love. "I was wondering if I could talk to you about Charlie," Alice ventured, her eyes meeting mine in a kind of quiet supplication. I noticed she was twisting her fingers, and for the first time understood just how nervous she was about coming to see me. "Why in the world would I want to talk to you about Charlie after all these years?" I asked incredulously. "Well, he is still your son," Alice stated in a rush, as if trying to sell me on the statement. Her eyes dropped from mine as she saw the instantaneous burst of rage appear. "My son!" I roared. "You have the nerve to come here after what you did to me and say that—" I was actually sputtering, flecks of spit coming out of my mouth as anger consumed me. "I knew this was a bad idea," Alice mumbled as she turned from me. "I just had to try." Amazingly, I could hear my wife's voice in my head, my Allison, who had taken me from the broken, bitter wreck I had been and helped me to rebuild my life into something that I could be proud of. It was like she was standing beside me and calming me. "Talk to her, finish it." Before Alice could get off the porch, I called to her, "Wait, we need to talk." She turned back to me as I waved her towards the open door. "Let's go inside and sit down." Alice cautiously came towards me and through the door, taking in the ambiance of a middle-class family home built around 3 precocious young women. I led her into the kitchen and started to make a pot of coffee as she sat down at the kitchen table. "Still cream? No sugar?" I asked as I busied myself making our coffee. At her nodded assent, I finished up and handed her a mug. Sitting myself across from her, I got the ball rolling. "So, tell me what's going on." "Well," started Alice cautiously, "as you probably know, Charlie has always been a handful, but he's become much worse these last few years." I cut her off before she continued. "How on earth would I know that Charlie is having problems? Have had no interest in you or Charlie from the time you moved out when he was less than a year old to today." Alice appeared a little startled by my statement, although why I had no clue. Between her and her wealthy doctor boyfriend, my access to Charlie had been a battle I could not and did not want to win. "I just thought you would try and keep up with what was going on in his life." Alice slowed to a stop, seeing by my expression that this tact was getting her nowhere. "I just want to say how sorry I am for how I handled our breakup." She tried again, going back to staring at her fingers, still nervously twisting. It was never my intention to hurt. She peeked up to see how I was handling this clear line of bullshit. Whatever she saw on my face seemed to convince her to start over again. Anyways, for the last few years, Charlie has been in trouble over a variety of things. Theft, getting in fights, and lately drugs. She sighed as if in preparation for what she was about to tell me. 2 weeks ago, he got in a fight and beat another boy very badly. There were drugs involved and a weapon and, well, now that he is over 18, they want to charge him as an adult. There were tears in her eyes as she looked back up at me. Joseph has cut him off and won't even hire a lawyer to defend him. He says he deserves to be in jail for all the other things. Alice stopped and I offered her a napkin to dry her eyes. I know I have no right to ask you after everything that happened, but I can't bear the thought of him in that awful prison. He's really a sweet boy. He's just... I let Alice slow to a halt, her breathing ragged as she tried to control her emotions. Alice looked at me, awaiting my response as I took a sip of my coffee. I stared at the wall briefly as I pondered what to tell her. Alice, do you remember the movie Trading Places? I asked, looking out over the calming vista of my backyard. Alice was back to being confused as she replied, You mean the one with Eddie Murphy? You used to make me watch it as part of our Christmas movie marathon? What does that have to do with... I raised my hand to stop her. Aside from being one of the greatest movies ever made, there was a strong philosophical question at the heart of the movie. I continued, knowing that Alice was more than a little bewildered as to where I was going with this. Mortimer and Randolph Duke had a bet about nature versus nurture. They wondered whether it was simple genetics or upbringing that enabled a person to be successful, so they set up a little experiment to see which one of them was right. I could see that Alice was becoming more confused by the second, so I thought I should bring a little focus to the story. Now, those guys were billionaires, so it was easy for them to set up that kind of experiment. For a normal guy like myself, it would be almost impossible to set something like that in motion. Hypothetically speaking, however, a normal guy like myself, in the right set of circumstances, could arrange for an experiment of his own. Alice's patience had obviously run out along with her last sip of coffee as she exclaimed, Matthew, what the hell are you talking about? I thought it best not to make eye contact as I continued. Let's say a normal guy, deeply in love with his wife and excitedly awaiting the arrival of his firstborn child. Hears of a terrible, terrible rumor. One that seems to indicate that the woman he has spent the last 8 years of his life worshipping and building his life around was in fact having an affair with a doctor where she worked. At this, I heard a gasp from Alice. Let's say this poor sap refused to believe those rumors, believed so strongly in the strength of character of his wife that he would not accept this disgusting innuendo until the wife of said doctor showed him transcripts and pictures proving that not only was his wife a duplicitous woman, but that the child she was carrying was that of her lover and that, since she and her boyfriend couldn't get married until he finished arranging for a divorce from his present wife, she was planning on passing the child off as her husband's until she and her boyfriend could be together. The doctor even laughingly mentioned getting child support. I looked over at a shocked and distraught Alice and stared directly into her eyes as I said, Of course this is all hypothetical, people that don't exist in the real world. As Alice began to quietly sob, I continued. Now imagine this poor sap looks at the choices available to him and doesn't like any of them. What if this just emphatically detests every avenue left open to him? Every night he comes home to a seemingly loving wife and watches her stomach grow, and as her stomach grows, his love for her dies. Day by day, inch by inch, he feels his heart grow cold. I looked over at Alice to see what she thought of my story, but she continued to weep quietly, elbows on the table, her head in her hands. But then, in the midst of his agony, a beautiful Christmas movie gives him an idea. Suddenly, his miasma of sadness is pierced by a sense of purpose. And from that day on, he moves towards his goal with a drive that surprises even him. He may not be as smart as a chief hospital administrator, although between you and me, Alice, he did pay her way through grad school, or an ER physician, but he was still pretty smart. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, of course, that he made friends with all of the nurses and staff who would work the hospital nursery and even the neonatal care group. Hell, he might even be at hospital Christmas parties with them while accompanying his wife. He may see them numerous times as part of the birthing classes. He may even have met a few of them for coffee, as a nervous dad-to-be in need of support. Well, Alice, I don't need to tell someone as smart as you that a person like that, with the help of a vengeful doctor's wife, could possibly get a chance to do something great, to prove at last the great hypothesis of Mortimer and Randolph Duke. I think at this point Alice began to get an idea of where this story was winding. I had mentioned earlier she was smart, and suddenly her weeping slowed and stopped. Suppose this great visionary then managed somehow to keep from his wife that she was literally tearing his heart from his chest every day as she defiled every single memory the couple had, doting on his support at home while planning to eviscerate him personally and financially as soon as she and her hat lover could arrange to be together. Once again, Alice, this is completely an imaginary tale. Monsters like that were invented to scare small children. I'm sure neither one of us could think of someone so heartless, so profane, that they would do this to someone they professed to love. Alice interjected with sadness in her voice. I thought I was in love. I completely lost myself in him, and I didn't. Once again, I stopped her with a quick shake of my head. Shush now, Alice. You're ruining the story, and I'm just getting to the good part now. Well, our hero, driven by his singular scientific purpose, now had everything in place. He simply needed to get things started. Fortunately for him, his wife no longer cared for him at all, or she would have seen the darkness that occasionally enveloped him and drove him down into deep depression. Only his sense of scientific duty kept him going. Alice was now staring at me with a look akin to horror as I laid out my tale. Her hands no longer twisting with nervousness, and her tears now lay dried on her cheeks as she waited in morbid fascination to hear the rest. Our hero was under a little pressure as things needed to happen quickly now. He soon found out, however, that some old wives' tales just had no value. For instance, you can feed your wife Chinese food 4 days in a row, and she still may not go into labor a couple of weeks prematurely. Acupuncture, however. I saw a look of sudden recognition come over Alice as her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach. At last, in the hospital for the happy day, the husband waits patiently for the birth of his non-son. He had made sure to find out the sex of the baby, even though his wife had preferred the sex of the child be a surprise. He had experienced enough surprises for a lifetime. As someone who has worked in hospitals most of her life, Alice, you probably know that security was a lot more relaxed back then. Our hero was almost surprised at how easy it all was, having arranged for a little celebration with joke cigars and cupcakes for everyone involved in the birth. Our hero was able to distract everyone long enough to allow his accomplice to get to work. Theoretically, his helper could be a doctor's wife who felt that her inability to have children, it probably led to her scumbag husband cheating on her with the woman he worked with. Alice visibly wrinkled her nose at my description as I continued. Imagine the level of excitement our hero must have felt, Alice. He was about to complete Mortimer and Randolph's experiment at a much more basic level, changing out the newborn baby of 2 very well-educated professionals for that of a 16-year-old heroin addict. He was finally about to... It was the crashing chair that let me know that Alice had fainted, and although I may not have rushed right over to help her, I did eventually get her back into her seat with a cold glass of water. Although I wasn't sure that Alice was completely with me at this point, her glassy, unfocused stare and the repeating tick in her cheek were my indicators. This story needed to be finally told to its completion. As I was saying, Alice, Our hero had finally achieved his ultimate goal. It should have been a moment of great celebration, and for a brief moment it was. But then he made the mistake of looking into the room where he saw his soon-to-be ex-wife recovering from her 12-hour labor. A massive wave of affection and nostalgia washed over him, and, just like that, he was done with it. The thought of taking away something that was so important to someone he had loved so much was suddenly too much to bear, and he resolved to undo it all right then and there. But, and Alice, you are going to want to hear this part because it is really important to this hypothetical tale. Just as he was about to end his experiment, something happened that enabled him to fulfill his destiny and set in motion events that have continued for 18 years until you arrived here today. Just as he was about to walk over to his wife and tell her everything, he noticed a doctor in scrubs walk into the room from a different door. Alice looked worried as I continued on. As he watched, he saw the doctor walk over to the woman on the bed and give her a kiss on the forehead. The hero was back to being a poor sap, as he watched his wife turn to her lover with pride in her eyes as the two of them shared the moment of the birth of their child. I looked back at Alice and saw that her eyes were squeezed shut, as if she was trying to mentally undo history. At that moment, Alice, our hero, was reborn. Like a phoenix from the ashes, any feelings he had once held for a wife were completely and irrevocably erased in a riot of fire. At that point, his commitment to the legacy of the Duke brothers was solidified and his path clear. Alice was staring at me with horror-filled eyes as she at last found her tongue. How could you do something like that to me, Matthew? To my poor baby. Her look entreated me to explain to her, so I did my best. Well, Alice, when you are dealing with DNA on a baby, you're talking 100%, 50%, or 0%. I wanted the baby to be 100% our DNA, you wanted him to be 50% our DNA, and he ended up being 0% our DNA. Really, none of us got what we wanted. I smiled encouragingly, hoping she could see my clearly sensible logic. I could see that Alice's brain was trying desperately to work its way through the many, many permutations created by my revelation. As I pointed out previously, other than morphing into a terrible person, she was always very sharp. It only took her a few moments to get to the heart of the matter. The only way you could know the result of your experiment is if you know how both kids turned out. You just found out how Charlie is doing. She didn't finish her sentence, instead looking at me questioningly. Well, hypothetically speaking, the experiment didn't work quite the way our hero anticipated. Turned out the 16-year-old heroin addict's son was already set for adoption. Hypothetically speaking, he grew up happily in a middle-class family and is presently in his second year of college, where he is hoping to end up in law school. If he follows through and becomes a lawyer, then he turns out, in the hero's humble opinion, worse than Charlie. I don't think Alice agreed with my take on the situation, and I could see the wheels turning as she tried to think of a way to get what she wanted. "Do you know where he's going to college?" she asked hopefully. "Not a chance," I said. "You want to put your DNA into a registry and see if he reaches out to find his birth parents, you are welcome to. Other than that, you are never going to get another word from me." This is all hypothetical anyways, I concluded with a smile. "Plus," I added, "you have a son you've raised for the last 18 years. Let's not forget about Charlie." Of course, Alice murmured as she slowly wandered towards the door. Knowing how long her loyalty to me and our marriage had lasted, once she got a look at something she considered better, I had a strong feeling that Charlie would soon be on his own. Walking out the front door, Alice turned back to me. "Matthew, for what it's worth, I really am sorry. Until you explained to me." I didn't let her finish. "Alice, it's okay. I'd like to think that the last 18 years of fighting between you and Joseph while raising someone else's troubled child has made us even." Alice began to respond to my guileless smile with one of her own before she thought through what I had said, and her smile turned into a frown. Before she could ask how I knew what was happening in their marriage, I was already turning back to my TV and closing the door. Maybe I could catch the second half. Subscribe to our channel to keep your partner from cheating on you, and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next.